Hey, what's up, and welcome back to the channel. So, I've been thinking about these philosophies a lot, and I wanted to share my thoughts. So, basically, in the philosophy of perception, a lot of people often debate direct realism versus indirect realism. Now, here's the thing. I definitely understand why people lean to either of these perspectives, whether it's direct or indirect realism. I always thought that both of them made sense. From like a very even like skeptical point of view, I can see the whole like indirect realist thing. But even the whole like direct realist, approach is still somewhat understandable to me because at least when we exist in this world environmentally, we're both talking perhaps about the same ontological thing. So perhaps intuitively, I'm finally starting to see how an external environment must at least exist. Ontologically, the external environment must exist, but phenomenologically, a lot of things might skew off, and that's why a lot of people have, debates and discussions about perception, and that's where you get indirect realism. So I, you know, thought about these, perspectives a lot, but nothing ever, quite felt satisfying about them because they were both relatable and understandable to me. I couldn't just lean on one side like, some people. But then I did a bit more digging and I discovered something called embodied cognition, which I already did a video on. And that video in particular is, in attack to why the idea of a soul doesn't really exist to me. But I think what that video is missing is the idea of situated cognition. And I think in that video, I ought to explain that aspect better because that should have been in my video about embodied cognition. I think it would have, cleared up or clarified things way better in terms of like how I perceive and understand, I guess let's just say perception and the notion of, consciousness. But basically I wanted to rely as well, relay, is that the way to say it? Fuck, I don't know. But anyway, there's also been a long discussion in philosophy about rationalism versus empiricism. So here's the thing. I'm a very nihilistic kind of person. I think overall, if you were to think about it hard enough, you can reach an epistemological, like nihilistic point. I even have a video on my channel basically talking about, yeah, skepticism and epistemological nihilism. So if you're interested in that further, you can just go ahead and, watch that video. Do watch that video. Give it more views. Make me famous. But anyway, um, I wanted to finally, like clean up my perspectives on certain things because I've criticized religion a lot on my channel, spirituality, God, or basically anything pertaining to, the supernatural. And the more I do it, it solidifies my views on empiricism because at the very least I trust naturalism, materialism, or physicalism better than anything, supernatural or let's just say, metaphysical because the idea of consciousness being so special has always been way too extra to me. I think everything about humans is pretty much more or less can be explained on a physical level. So that's why I made that video on embodied cognition. But then a lot of people were bringing up to me, well, I think I remember one comment in particular on that video talking about the hard problem of like consciousness, quote unquote. And I think like it doesn't really make sense to me now that I think about it. When I was in more of a rationalist state rather than focusing on like empirical things, I can see why people might, think that the whole like the hard problem of consciousness thing is, such big deal. But when I think of like embodied cognition and situated cognition, by the way, is, the environmental aspect of embodied cognition. So basically, it when you consider embodied cognition, which is basically that an organism's understanding of itself is within, its body and its vessel, our senses, but it also coincides with the external, like environment in which it inhabits. And there is no breaking off point that I think the mistake that a lot of like spiritual or like religious people make because they believe in like hypothetically, like if you're a Christian, you might believe in like souls or something, which I really don't understand, which is why I think the idea of like an afterlife is so absurd to me because I cannot comprehend having perception if the vessel in which you perceive the world, which is basically, your body. So if your senses were to disappear, then I believe you would be nothing because, when you die and you're just going to be like bone after like the maggots eat you like within the ground, it's not going to function anymore. Like if we take it simplistically, even just like focusing on the eyes, it's no different than like, okay, if I smash a camera, it's not going to work anymore because, it's destroyed, it's broken, whatever. So basically I see the body as, no difference. But I think okay, see, this is a position that's a little bit difficult to explain when you're talking about like embodied cognition and like inactivism, because I do realize that it might sound a bit jumbled to a lot of people because I'm going to be borrowing a lot of aspects as to why I think direct realism is quite understandable and indirect realism is also quite understandable. But I wanted to make this video, and the reason why I brought up, like the whole like rationalism versus like empiricism thing is because I do believe that overall everything is still empirical. Even if I wouldn't necessarily discredit, like rationalism, because I'm quite a philosophical person, so I have nothing against, like rationalism. I do contemplate like the abstract, like, constantly because philosophy is something that I am very much, interested in. But considering that, I'm hoping because at least like the idea that I had in my mind was that when I make this video, it would make things a bit more easy to understand. So I think the misconception that a lot of like religious and like supernatural believing people is that basically we exist beyond the body. So basically something like souls, so to speak, because they tie in that there must be some sort of like individuality to like a person. And yes, there is an individuality, but I kind of think that's dumb because, okay, the reason why I still think that everything is still empirical overall, or that it deals in some sort of like naturalism, physicalism, or some kind of like materialism, is basically because even your own quote unquote like individuality is still based around the situated cognition of events. And I would just relay that to like the capabilities of like your body, so to speak. So any joy or like pleasure that you have can easily be explained with like, like a neuroscientific perspective in terms of like what makes your brain light up in happiness or quote unquote like passion in a way that like a lot of people might be dramatic about it. But it is not separate, from you. Because a lot of people might argue that like basically there is an essence to a person because we have some kind of like overhyped, unreasonable sense of like individuality that is, like special to us. Like, oh, let's just say, for example, this person is naturally better at basketball. This person is naturally better at soccer. I don't know, but I would disagree with that because I don't think that all of your joys and passion, even if you want to say like ball is life or like whatever, is something that speaks a lot about you. That is still you reacting within your body's capability and what the external environment in which you inhabit allows, which is basically a situated, like cognition like sort of thing. So, for example, a lot of people that are tall are often very good at basketball because, it's an advantage into getting, the ball into the hoop or whatever. So maybe that would lean somebody being better at, let's say, something like basketball, and they might tell themselves that like, oh, this is like a passion of mine, quote unquote, because oh, but it's actually a distorted perception because they were already given an upper hand again through their embodied cognition and their capabilities that they're able to do this, but they had no say in how their body operates. They had no say in how their body functions. So a lot of this is still deterministic in the sense of like, okay, sure, you can have the illusion of free will. You can have an illusion of something that like separates you from everything else. So you think, oh, basketball or anything in general is like some sort of like special perception to you. But that doesn't really make any sense because maybe basketball isn't the greatest example. I don't know. A lot of like language about like souls is like way too like nonsensical if I'm just being honest, at least like from my point of view. It's like super nonsensical, so maybe somebody's going to say like, oh, basketball is not even a good example because I do have quite a lot of like conversations with people that are religious online, spiritual online, or like whatever. So I'm sure somebody might say something like that, at least just like based on like my, experience. But at least like if you're gonna talk about like, essence or like passion and you're talking about it as something like beyond this world, then that's something that you're, legitimately gonna have to prove. Because I think where somebody, is easily drawn is something that a lot of people might think points to some sort of like metaphysical thing, because they'll end up saying that like, oh, how come so and so isn't attached to this if it was all just like the environment? So I'm like, yeah, okay, I agree with that. It's not all just the environment, but I'm saying that ultimately it is the environment that allows where you can quote unquote individually lean to, in contrast with what your how your body operates in a way where it's like, okay, I don't know, happy chemicals, dopamine, whatever, or like something like that, like, kicks off when you like lean towards these particular things. Maybe it doesn't for like somebody else, but basically the environment is still always the host of these things. And I don't know how you're going to deny basically like neuroscience in the sense of like, okay, it goes beyond like, let's say, like, like brain wirings or like something like that, because everything in this world that occurs, because like, okay, so here's the thing, even if you believe that there's something more to the reality than just like the physical, quote unquote, like tangible, like sort of like world, you can't deny that this, physical and like tangible like world is, quote unquote here. That's why a lot of religious and like supernatural believing kind of like people have to overly rely on rationalism, but that doesn't actually make sense. At least even if you're going to refer to it on like a practical sort of like basis, because like, okay, we can challenge, like skepticism like all day, but like again, watch my video on it if you want to see further in terms of like what I'm talking about. You cannot go beyond axioms. And like, okay, I wanted to talk as well about like AJ Ayer's like logical positivism, because I had a discussion with like one of my friends online about like the validity of like metaphysics, and I was like trying to defend logical positivism because it doesn't really make any, sense. But at least like if we're talking about like the axiom of like how the world works, okay, sure. I might not be able to go beyond quote unquote like that axiom, because like yes, okay, within like my perception, it is just a starting point that like the self, the body and how it works, and the how you interact with like the environment together, it just has to, quote unquote like coincide. That's just like my starting point. So sure, maybe I wouldn't necessarily be able to like, like fully like explain that, but at least like, but at least like what I'm trying to explain though is that like that's all that there is. You're actually the one putting, like a higher burden of proof on you if you say that there's a soul, say that there's an essence, or basically imply the notion that like there is something at play more than the human or like the organism and its, environment itself. So the reason why I kept bringing up, or at least like I'm trying to bring up like examples in terms of like, okay, you can find your individuality, but it's unreasonable to me that like you're gonna link that like this is supposedly because of like, oh, a soul or some sort of like metaphysical thing, when it's like, okay, everything can be explained within like brain states. And even if like, okay, see, I'll say this. I think what I think is extreme about like direct realism, which is obviously why I wouldn't, fully call myself like a direct realist, is that like basically there's an understanding. And yeah, it would be fair. I get it. I would lean towards it in that specific context when like the indirect realists are trying to argue with like the direct realists. But again, I don't believe that indirect realism cannot be criticized, which is why I'm basically saying that like both of these have to come together, and that's where you get embodied cognition or like in activism. Because sure, I can believe in like a brain in a vat, which is I guess like what allows like what an indirect realist approach would allow the entertaining of like, okay, this is just something that exists like as like a quote unquote like simulation. So I think yes, we are a brain in a vat, but it's more like a brain in our own like body, uh, literally. Because sure, I don't disagree that we put our own filter onto like the external world, but it seems like such a radical leap to me that like because we might put our own filter in the world based on like how our body is like uh, operating and working, that like there must be some sort of like extreme individuality in the sense that it goes more beyond what like physical or like natural means can, explain. And at least like, okay, I was discussing with a particular friend as well, and which is why I kind of started to like, I guess like be skeptical about my own skepticism in the sense that like perhaps I can finally start to see because of the help of embodied cognition and because of the help of like in activism that like okay, body and environment must always work together in order to like form some sort of like consciousness because like basically if humans could truly at the at our core because like okay, I mean this is obviously also going to depend on like how you personally define a soul as well, but at least like from a lot of people that like I've spoken to, I've always understood, or at least like from what I've gathered from them, is that like a soul has to transcend basically a physical body, at least maybe from like a Christian Abrahamic context, more like or something like that. So what I want to say about that though is that like why can't you rationalize colors to like a blind person basically? Like I'm talking about a blind person that's been blind their entire life, so they have no experience of red, they have no experience of like this quote unquote. And then we got into like a whole argument again about like, okay, so sure, plenty of things can go into like how color is like quote unquote like perceived, but like at a baseline, it requires a sense. So sure, somebody that's colorblind might not be on the same level as somebody that's like, blind their entire life so that they don't know like what a color is. But at least like I guess intuitively rationally, indirectly, um, it still tells us that despite it being indirect, the ontology of color, so the existence of color must exist in and of itself, even if like phenomenologically we cannot, pursue that, you know, understanding of it properly. So sure, the only reason that anything is distorted, quote unquote, whatever that like actually is because like it doesn't come from like any sort of like, I guess like higher essence, quote unquote. Like I think like this is like the misconception and like the distortion back then that caused a lot of like people to think that like okay, like when people for example were not as well versed in understanding mental illness, they might have seen somebody that was like schizophrenic and might have just assumed that they were like, possessed by the devil or possessed by like demons or like some sort of shit, even though there was a perfectly, like valid explanation. And at least like we have a better understanding now. So that's why if anybody wants to link mental struggles to anything like supernatural, or like if anybody wants to say like, the dumb bullshit that's like, oh, well, you're not happy because you don't believe in God or some shit like that, like I still find that like super stupid because like, okay, that has nothing to do with the devil. That has nothing to do with like any like outside supernatural forces messing or something like that. Because even mental illness itself can still be explained within like I guess like the neuroscientific way or like like the physical way in which like your brain works. Like okay, let's just say even take simply with like depression. Oh, this person is depressed because they don't release enough what is the chemical like serotonin or like basically like the chemicals needed to like naturally regulate a person and doesn't make them you know how depression works like super apathetic to the point where like they have a higher risk of like going against like their survival instinct and like killing themselves and whatnot. So like even these mistakes, whatever you want to call it, because like we can always argue indirectly, right? We can always see that indirect realist approach and be like, oh yeah, this is true. But it's like again, that's only because of you. That's only because of like how you're set up. So sure, and this is why I would actually say that like humans are actually quite like egotistical because sure, you can have the drive to explain everything that like you're, compelled to like experience in, a certain way. As a narcissist, I definitely, quite do understand that. But it's like I guess like I'm saying like within like the religious context, like it is purely just cope though. So I've always thought like, okay, yeah, you're trapped in your own mind, but we are forced together to be trapped in our own minds in this, external cage that must, be real in, some sort of way, I guess, or that like, it must like somehow still like be, you know, something that's like a part of like the environment, I guess. And also because yeah, I've been thinking a lot about like a priori and like a posteriori and like stuff like that. And at least like I don't know, I'm starting to question if I actually can believe that there is such a thing as like a priori knowledge. I know I'm going all over the place in this video, but I'm just, these are the styles of my videos. If you've seen them, like that's like obviously how it is. So I'm just trying to get as much of my thoughts out, like as much as possible. But like when you're born into like, the world, the first thing you do is cry. And I remember I had a conversation with like one particular person where it's like he made the jump to say that like, oh, there must be a God because like, oh, who teaches you to cry? And that's like super ridiculous. So like don't get me wrong, I still know that there are better arguments. I don't agree with the arguments, so like there are still better arguments for God, than that. But when I think about that, because yeah, when I think about that in comparison to like what I want to say right now, yeah, it's just like so stupid and ridiculous because at least like my empiricist views, I think, are definitely, like growing stronger. And I might just say, okay, I think all knowledge at the very least must be a posteriori. And the only reason we have the sense of like our own rationale, our own rationalism, is due to the indirect realism. But the indirect realism only comes from the limitations in which our bodies operate. Or who's to say it's a limitation? Yeah, okay. If your body is built, your organism, your whatever, your biology is like built in like a certain way. Yeah, we're all biased to accept it. So we're biased by our own biology and we're restricted and contained by how the external world works, regardless of whether or not our bias is able to properly pick it up or not. And that's why we have, complete arguments and, philosophical disagreements about like a lot of stuff. But also, okay, yeah, referring to my empirical views growing like like even stronger and whatnot, I wanted to talk about oh yeah, logical positivism by like AJ Ayer as well, because yeah, okay, I know I mentioned this like way earlier, but I think like okay, I'm gonna like clear this up now. Okay, I was having a a discussion with like one of my friends about like the validity of like metaphysics because this is something that like we really clash on because I, I don't know, like the idea of like metaphysics in the sense that like a soul is metaphysical or like like the notion of like an I existing beyond like physical natural like means so to speak is just something that like I don't get. And he told me that basically the verification principle doesn't really make any sense because let's say uh like if truth, quote unquote, like truth can only be validated through like empirical means, then there's no way to like quote unquote like prove that statement. But yeah, like what I said, it's axiomatic to me. So at least like I don't think that that statement needs a rationale because oh yeah, I wanted to say this. I think the only reason we have rational understanding, despite basing everything off of like empirical data and living in an empirical world, is because our bias in which how kind of like what I said, like if you look at it through like embodied cognition, our bias in terms of like how our uh yes, how our biology, our structure, our biological structure, like whatever, like perceives things, it retains the information that it is biased to pick up. So I think that's the only reason why there is such a thing as like rationalism, basically, because again, I'm not saying it's perfect, but at least like because we are trapped in our own minds are attempting to retain as much information about it as much as possible, but at least like but like obviously within like an external reality it doesn't care, it exists independent of us, it's going to react in the way that like it ultimately wants. So because our cope and our like need for structure through our indirect realist like bias within again, nothing supernatural, nothing about a soul, nothing about like oh transcending higher is like an individual, just the pure mechanism in which your biology works, it's going to hold on to that as much as it can because that's the only thing that it can pick up from, again, an empirical world. So I understand why people might take this to an extreme and entertain that perhaps that like oh okay, maybe everything is just in my head, everything is just being projected. But I mean, no, this is always happening simultaneously. And I don't even think it's necessarily a discussion about like phenomenology. I think at least like, okay, I would need to read more about like ontologically on ontology. So if I've been using this word wrong, at least from like your perspective, then like I mean, maybe that's why. But like again, at least yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't think of consciousness as like a stable thing, or at least like as a soul as like a stable thing. So I think I'm gonna have to read a bit more like process philosophy, because at least like what I ontologically understand is that our bodies exist. What I ontologically understand is that the environment that that body inhabits exists, and this is what creates, consciousness, because it cannot be one without the other. They always come together. But it's not intelligently designed. So again, I'm putting like a whole bunch of like things like in this space. So I think okay, like yeah, that's essentially the problem. So I think if anything, this points to the whole like, okay, this is why there's no God, because that's the contradictory like nature of like basically reality. You're trapped within the context of your body that is still a physical thing, but can still manipulate, can still put a filter. No different than how an Instagram app can put yeah, the Instagram app can put a filter on the picture, but no one's questioning the validity of the picture itself. So why are they biased when it comes to like their own consciousness? That's what I don't understand. Like they think because they have something they can project onto the external environment, they must exist beyond the external environment, even though like okay, so this is what I think overall. Even if there's confusion because of like the whole like indirect like realist like sort of like thing, it still exists in the environment. But yeah, okay. Those are just some things for you guys to think about if you've watched this far. Haven't made a video this long in a while, at least. So, yeah, there's a lot of me. Thank you very much.